if I'm a remotely competent European leader, I'm trying to bring Chinese investment into the European continent to the best of my ability. Okay, I'm trying to set up as many cooperation agreements with China as I possibly can. I'm like petitioning the EU to be like, dude, we got to lean into this China shit. And of course, other leaders are taking up that power void that remains. Of course, the summit that took place between India, Russia, and China. I'm going to go pee real quick.
Holding hands, Russia's Vladimir Putin and India's Narendra Modi head straight for their host, Chinese President Xi Jinping. They form a huddle with their translators and exchange a few words, even a few laughs. For Xi, the optics are ideal as he seeks to assert himself as a world leader they can count on. In his opening speech at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, he told members that global governance had reached a new crossroads, taking not-so-subtle jabs at the United States.
We should uphold fairness and justice. We must promote a correct historical perspective on World War II and oppose the Cold War mentality. We should block confrontation and bullying practices.
When Donald Trump upended the global trading system, he provided fertile ground for President Xi to rally partners from around the world. This summit is one example, aiming to strengthen ties between more than 20 countries from across Asia and the Middle East through cooperation on issues ranging from AI, infrastructure, or the creation of an SCO development bank. Modi would have once been much more cautious about showing public displays of affection for Putin and Xi as he tried to cultivate India's relationship with the US. But with Delhi currently facing a 50% levy on its exports, analysts say Modi has been pushed into the arms of his Chinese counterpart, even despite years of tensions over a border dispute.
The Shanghai Cooperation Organization can become the guiding light for multilateralism and an inclusive world order.
Meanwhile,
people always say do nothing, win, but like this is doing something. It's not doing nothing. He is doing something. Okay? It's really interesting. It's so funny that this is happening for actually no reason. I mean, it's not necessarily, there is a reason for this. Part of that is because Donald Trump is in this unique bind where on the one hand, he must, for the foreign policy decisions of America, for the State Department, he has to apply pressure to Russia because Russia is delivering a significant blow to American hegemony by, disrupting the power that America had as the world police, right? He's like, nope, I'm going to invade Ukraine. I'm going to kill as many people as I want, and you can't do anything about it. And then after years and years of America being like, no, you can't do that. We're going to help Ukraine to the best of our ability. It's clear that it hasn't worked. But on top of the existing sanctions, there is obviously another sanctions package that Donald Trump could potentially entertain. This sanctions package is against India because India is basically now assumed the role of a mediator for Russian oil and Russian energy to enter the international markets to avoid the sanctions, right? Problem is, India is also a key ally against China. India is supposed to be the bulwark against Chinese socialism, growing Chinese socialism in the region, growing Chinese power in the region. So you can't really sanction India, especially at a time like this, as I have described time and time again. Trump knows this. So even the mere threat of sanctioning India is enough for India to go back into the hands of China and maybe even leverage America by exhibiting a closeness to China to get more favorable deals out of the United States of America. And that's where we're at.
Xi was gearing up for his next major event, a military parade in Beijing attended by leaders of Russia, North Korea and Iran to mark 80 years since the end of the Second World War.
Chinese President Xi Jinping opened the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin by calling on leaders to work harder to forge a new world order.
A global governance concept based on consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits.
Also, once again, Modi's still Modi, okay? Close to China, anti-China, doesn't matter. That's still okay? Let's be real. This is, in some respects, like if Xi Jinping was developing closer ties with Israel. It's not the same as Israel, but Modi is a Modi Modi, I would say, is like closest in ideological alignment to a country like Israel or a leader like Benjamin Netanyahu. So it's not. This isn't. This is yet again further evidence that there is no internationalist socialist perspective developing socialism around the globe coming from the Chinese side. Okay.
Practicing genuine multilateralism, deepening cooperation with the United Nations, and constructively participating in international and regional affairs.
It was the largest gathering of the trade and security bloc since it was founded in 2001, participating with some of China's closest partners and friends, including Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was also in attendance. During a bilateral meeting with President Xi, he pledged to improve New Delhi's previously frosty ties with Beijing. Modi's visit to China comes days after the US imposed a 50% tariff on Indian goods.
There was an expectation that this Trump administration would continue to be a close partner for India. And the fact that that hasn't worked out means that India might have neglected the region for.
They're offering stability that the USA doesn't. On the international scale, China, especially in that region, especially in Asia, is beefing up Asian cooperation because they're saying, look, America's unstable, it's dangerous, it's a madman. And you can see it, we can see it, we can all see it. We offer stability. On the other hand, if you look at internal politics in India, I feel like Modi's time is running out. The walls are closing in. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like for Modi and the BJP in general, but this kind of this kind of olive branch extended to the BJP by China, I suspect, gives more power to Modi. It's a saving grace for someone like Modi. What do you even know about Indian politics? By my own admission, I think it's incredibly complex, and I don't fully comprehend it. I am the first to admit that. So if you take issue with what I'm saying currently, domestic Indian affairs, and what Modi is seeking to do here, you can tell me if I'm wrong on any of this, but I feel like it's not very, my analysis is fairly reductive.
Far too long.
Many of the nations at this summit share India's frustrations with US tariffs. Xi Jinping wants to harness that frustration and motivate SCO members to work more closely together to reduce their reliance on Western-led security initiatives and trade. The bloc signed a joint statement and agreed on a development plan for the next decade, pledging wider cooperation in energy, infrastructure, green industries, the digital economy, and artificial intelligence. An SCO development bank.
You do understand that Xi doesn't choose the Indian prime minister, right? No, of course not. What do you mean? I'm not saying that at all. I'm not sure how much power Xi Jinping would have over Indian affairs in general, but the power that he does have is a very important regional power he is using to prop up Modi like this. And the reason why he's doing that is because this is, once again, America's major bulwark in the region against growing Chinese influence. So it's purely self-interested from the Chinese perspective.
Will be established, with some pushing for an independent payment system to reduce dependence on the dollar and circumvent Western sanctions.
In the face of a resurgence of unilateral bullying, the summit issued a statement firmly supporting the multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organization at its core. It called for the elimination of unilateral practices that violate WTO rules, sending a clear message of rejecting hegemony and upholding fairness, and voicing a shared commitment to maintaining an open world economy.
China has pledged to provide $218 million in aid and loans to member states and expand educational opportunities. Numerous meetings were held on the sidelines, which provided an opportunity for Putin to brief Modi and Xi on his summit with US President Donald Trump in Alaska last month. a meeting he said he hoped would pave the way to peace in Ukraine. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera, Tianjin, China.
Don't miss out. Get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable.
We're trade maxing.
New comments from Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who took a veiled dig at the U.S. as he promoted his vision of a new global order. Xi told leaders at a major summit, quote, "The house rules of a few countries should not be imposed by others." He said more as well.
We should advocate for an equal and orderly, multipolar world and a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization, and make the global governance system more just and equitable.
What truly interesting is who was there rubbing shoulders with Xi. Russia's Vladimir Putin and India's Narendra Modi all shared a laugh with the Chinese leader on the sidelines, really almost literally.
Dude, I don't understand one thing here. Like, if I'm a remotely competent European leader, I'm trying to bring Chinese investment into the European continent to the best of my ability. Okay, I'm trying to set up as many cooperation agreements with China as I possibly can. I'm like petitioning the EU to be like, dude, we got to lean into this China shit. It doesn't make any fucking sense that you're looking at the situation and the lordship over there is demanding more in tithing from you, and all of these leaders around you in Europe are going, yes, sir. Yes, master. We will give you whatever you want to America. Like, there is no way out of this. There's no way out of this without like leaning into the same exact leverage point that every other global South country has leaned into, which is developing separate agreements with China. Like, even if you're not going to fully cooperate with China, it doesn't make any sense that you would not at least try to get a better deal out of the United States of America by leaning in that direction in the same way that like even India is doing, you know? And I genuinely don't see it. I don't understand it. And if you talk to like Europe politicians, if you talk to European politicians, if you talk to politicians that have existed under the security banner of America in any NATO nation, they literally are just like, nah, dude, you cannot trust the Chinese. Straight up, you cannot trust the Chinese ever. That is unironically their position. They're like, look, America is great. It's helpful. It's helped us. It helped us prosper post World War II. We were really scared about socialism growing. We did not want that to happen. That's why we found ourselves in the comfortable bosom of American security. But like in the EU especially, or even in like Japan, on the one hand, there are obviously because of its proximity, there are a lot of important trade relations with China. But in the EU, while there is important trade relations with China, they are totally, it's a non-starter. The notion that like you would ever do any sort of like leaning towards China is a non-starter, even if it's a point of leverage.
Rubbing shoulders. For Modi, it was his first trip to China in 7 years. Let's get right to CNN's Ivan Watson, who is in Tianjin.
Sweet Bear, bro, China is the enemy here, and I've never had a politician explain why. I mean, the question remains, the USSR was the enemy as well. It's just like, what's the reason? Because like everything you could point to the USSR with respect to USSR being the enemy, America has done tenfold. You know what I mean? Like you say, oh, encroachment. They're forcibly controlling they're forcibly controlling all these like Eastern Bloc countries, and that's bad. And it's like, okay, but then America's doing their own version of that, maybe with a more quote unquote peaceful approach, seemingly. But as far as like imperialism goes, they continued that tenfold, propping up military dictatorships, overthrowing people's interest in maintaining their own sovereignty, autonomy, voting democratically for, social democrats or socialists, God forbid. Like, even when we talk about Chinese imperialism in Africa, this is a great example of this. Like, do you see what I mean? This is what I mean. Everything that you can point to with respect to the USSR or even China now, America is doing tenfold and has done so tenfold, which is precisely the reason why these guys in these respective nations have decided to align with China over America because they at least look at it and go, well, they don't have 400 years of chattel slavery that they can point to, and also their loans are better. And this is a reality that even American thinkers and American analysts are aware of. Like, this is the Chinese imperialism and Africa narrative, the Belt and Road initiatives. They got a lot of play in the DC think tank foreign policy sector for quite a while. But the new meta now is to actually recognize that Chinese loans offer far more favorable conditions than the IMF and the World Bank ever could. And there's a lot of loan forgiveness that comes along with it as well. And therefore, you have thinkers that write for, foreign policy mag and stuff like that, that openly will say, we have to get better. We have to deliver better, more peaceful, and less interventionist loans than China is doing, than China is offering. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization SCO summit in Tianjin is a key gathering for Iran after the U.S.-Israel war. Tehran is set to deepen its relationship with China in a way it hasn't before, moving beyond its past short-term crisis-driven outreach. This is SCO's largest summit since its 2001 founding. Over 20 countries plus at least 10 international bodies, including the UN Secretary General, are present. The scale reflects how China is filling the gaps left by Trump's disruption of the global order. For Iran, the timing is crucial. The E3, Germany, UK, France just triggered the snapback of UN sanctions. Iran is still reeling from the aftershocks of war with Israel and the US. Significantly at Tianjin, SCO leaders condemned the US and Israel attack on Iran in June. Foreign Minister Arakshi, alongside his Russian and Chinese counterparts, sent a joint letter to the UN rejecting the snapback. They argued it lacks legal basis and is politically destructive. For Tehran, this is a rare moment of visible backing from two global powers at a key moment. China and Russia joined Iran in rejecting the European move to restore sanctions on Tehran. A letter from the Chinese, Russian, and Iranian foreign ministers called Britain, France, and Germany's move to restore sanctions via the snapback mechanism legally and procedurally flawed. What's interesting about this is that, yes, on the one hand, you got Russia making these sorts of statements, and you go, well, okay, you're Russia. You deserve the sanctions for your encroachments, your irredentist actions in Ukraine, your fucking war that you're waging in Ukraine. But on the other hand, if you were to put yourself in the shoes of Iranian leadership for a brief moment, you would kind of recognize that Western nations are doing that to Iran in an even more unjustifiable, with an even more unjustifiable reason when you consider it additional sanctions and this aggressive enforcement that seeks to cripple the Iranian economy even further, to starve out the Iranian economy even further, is utterly ridiculous. Contrary to much of Western analysis, Iran hasn't decisively pivoted to China yet. It often abandoned Beijing for short-term openings with the U.S. and EU efforts Israel has successfully blocked. China, for its part, has long showed strategic mistrust of Iran. Even Xi Jinping's 2016 $40 billion offer for rail, refiner, and power plant investments was sidelined. Iran gave South Pars contracts to total over Chinese firms after the JCPOA. The 25-year roadmap proved symbolic for Iran. Beijing saw Tehran turn to it only in times of crisis. But Iran has always been unimaginably invested in maintaining sovereignty. Okay. I'm not making an assessment on whether this is good or bad. I'm just telling you that they've always chosen sovereignty and also leveraging the reverse relationship that they don't even have with Western powers against China with regular frequency. If you have all of these, if you have nations in Africa leveraging the pre-existing harm that they saw from Western powers to create an environment of cooperation with China, Iran, for some weird reason, has done the exact opposite, where time and time again, they have shown mistrust to China, even when China is demonstrated that they have a strategic interest in cooperating with Iran as their own little bulwark against Western imperialism in the region. Russia is not irredentis Lamau, just the irrational justification of Putin's dumbass gave for a rational invasion after they were left no choice thanks to NATO threatening to have nukes positioned at Kharkiv at a distance equivalent to Detroit to DC to Moscow. It is absolutely irredentis. If we know that there was never going to be NATO encroachment in Ukraine, you think Vladimir Putin miscalculated that? No, of course he didn't. There was already pre-existing instability in LPR and DPR, and they had already annexed Crimea. It is absolutely an additional push for more land and more control over Ukraine. It's ridiculous. Come on, please stop. Now the Iranian calculus may be shifting. Iranian Defense Minister Nazirizadeh at the SCO. Orgs like Shanghai and BRICS can substitute unilateralism by forming new alliances. Regional security will be ensured with SCO cooperation. Iran is signaling readiness for deeper long-term cooperation with China. This stretches from Afghanistan to the Persian Gulf to Xinjiang and shaping the future of Central Asia, South Asia, and the Caucasus in the wake of the IMEC and the Trump corridor. I'm not saying this because I'm Turkish and I do often meme about Turkey being at the table, but a key component of this, or I guess like the last remaining castle for American imperialism in this region would be Turkey, because every single Turkic region that spans from China all the way to Europe is still very much aligned with Turkey here and get logistical training and supplies from the Turkish military. And therefore, Turkey being the NATO nation that it is a very important factor as far as like China having its own backyard and the entire Asian continent cleared of like American intervention so they can do trade maxing to the best of their ability by rail and you know, develop their supply lines in the way that they want to. Beijing-Tehran shared interests go beyond security. Beijing-Tehran ties can deepen to include more durable energy deals, oil, gas, renewables, major Chinese investment in Chabahar as a counter to U.S. corridors, and tech transfer in cutting-edge fields like AI. At the SCO summit, Pezeshkian welcomed China's call for reform and global governance. He backed SCO financial cooperation to cut dollar dependence, new rapid crisis response mechanisms, SCO Strategic Studies Center, Chabahar linking China, Central Asia, and the Indian Ocean. Iran sees the SCO's 10-year strategy as a chance to anchor itself in a multipolar order. Beijing's support in infrastructure and defense will hinge on Tehran showing long-term commitment and on how the U.S. and Europe will engage with Iran. China's invitation for Iran to its World War II Victory Day military parade while excluding Israel, the U.S. and EU, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE is telling. The message, Iran is part of Beijing's envisioned multipolar order. How we even ended up here is absurd. I think many people will say Trump is the reason for this. I think that's incorrect. I think Trump is simply the accelerant. Okay? That's
Despite
it.
a long-running...
I think Trump is simply the accelerant. Trump is giving the much-needed push to all of these other periphery countries by behaving in this inconsistent and irrational manner. But overall, like, global designs such as this one do not exchange hands overnight. They don't, you can't turn the tide of history with one leadership over the next. It's not like this has been a long time coming. This is decades of sanctions and America basically turning China into the manufacturing hub of the entire planet. It's a long time. That gave China a tremendous political influence and power because it caused it basically made China intervention proof because you can't destroy your own manufacturing hub. It started with the shit talking during COVID that started the polarization. Biden wrapped up. No. It's far before COVID. No. This is far before COVID. COVID could be seen as another accelerant, and Trump certainly is an accelerant. But I wouldn't say that it's like one singular event. But it definitely ne oldu? Niye gelsin orada oynasın onlar? Okey gitsin ıslansın. Bırak sen. Açık kalsın, sıkıntı yok. Yeah. Is that a Jeffrey Epstein tattoo on his hand? Yeah, he loves him. He loves Jeffrey. Anyway, let's look at TLDR News Global. Why China's economy is stalling.
Property crisis and Trump's unprecedented tariffs, the Chinese economy has held up surprisingly well. Domestically, declines in property investment have been mostly offset by increased investment in high-tech manufacturing. And while exports to the US have fallen somewhat, they haven't fallen as much as you might expect. And Chinese producers have apparently been able to offset any decline by just redirecting their exports elsewhere, including to Europe. Nonetheless, in the past month or so, the Chinese economy has shown new signs of strain, and a combination of debt and deflation take their toll on industry. So in this video, we're going to explain how the Chinese economy outperformed expectations over the past couple of years, and what's gone wrong. Have you ever wondered how much money TLDR makes each year? Or who's funding our journalism? Well, we think transparency is super important. So we answer both questions in our recent video. It's linked in the description. Business investment, household consumption, and the of four things. Government unbalanced. In short, GDP is defined as economic woes. You need to understand how the Chinese economy is fundamentally unbalanced. In short, GDP is defined as the sum of four things: government spending, business investment, household consumption, and the difference between exports and imports. In China, consumption accounts for a lower than average share of GDP, while investment and net exports account for a higher than average share. A recent analysis by the University of Groningen found that, in 2019, household consumption accounted for
It's really hard for me to value Western perspective on China's economy because they do have a different system and priorities. I know. And for the record, this has been a major issue for Western analysts from the jump. Okay? Western analysts refuse to contend with, they only look at the Chinese economy and Chinese goals from a Western lens, a Western capitalist lens that focuses on the GDP. One of the best examples that I can point to you as far as trying to fit Chinese governance into a Western lens and failing to understand what's going on in China has been ghost cities, right? For the longest time, Western analysts looked at China and said, oh, these guys are so stupid. They're just trying to do economic output domestically by building all these cities, but haha, these cities are all empty. These are ghost cities. Look at how stupid they are. Look at how silly they are, right? And that is because in America and in the Western world broadly, you look at home ownership not as a means of shelter, but as a means of economic activity, okay? It's supposed to be an asset, a speculative asset to be traded on the stock market. So they don't actually realize that like a government could have broad-reaching, multiple decades-long agendas to rapidly urbanize, for example. This is just not a thing that is within the Western liberal field of vision, right? So because we don't have any sort of like real long-term planning, or even if we do have long-term planning, our long-term planning is still very much at the behest of capital. We can't even see a world outside of that horse blinders that we have on. And oftentimes this is the reason why Western analysis on China actually falls short. This is yet another byproduct of this is yet another issue with that analysis, but by simply looking at the GDP. And when things don't unfold predicted they would in China, because they will consistently claim, oh, it's on the verge of collapse any day now, any moment now, any day now, China's going to collapse, China's going to collapse, China's going to collapse. When that doesn't happen, they turn around and they look for alternative reasons. Even in the Trump tariff panic, at the peak of Trump's tariff agenda, when Trump was single-handedly undermining decades-long American designs for global trade, everybody kept saying, oh, China can just like simply withstand this pressure because they're a dictatorship, right? They could just like withstand it because they're a dictatorship. Not realizing that like a government that does have that level of centralized control could withstand, like it's an upper hand when the United States of America's system of control is far more decentralized and far more invested in short-term gains and short-term benefits for corporations, China has central planning, and therefore they have a much better capacity to withstand economic shocks, economic pressures that come from Western instability. But instead of saying that, because that would undermine everything that you have learned in school and higher education about the glories of neoliberalism, you have to look for an alternative reason. And you say, oh, it's because they're a dictatorship. They could just like brutally crack the whip on their population if there was any sort of fucking instability whatsoever. I think this creates bad analysis. You don't have to love China, okay? My goal here is to approach what China is doing and engage in analysis of what China is doing with the terms that they set for themselves. There is no reason, especially in 2025, I don't think there's any reason to not look at like 15-year plans that they put forth as like silly pie in the sky ideas, when very clearly those plans are being pushed no matter what. The notion that like the notion that like you don't understand that the leadership within the Chinese party of the Communist Party of China is still very much invested in like their own short-term benefits and lining up their own pockets, and they're not actually invested in the improving the welfare of all Chinese citizens, I think is faulty analysis overall, and it will cause you to make wrong predictions over and over again, as many Western analysts have.
39% of China's GDP, compared to a global average of about 60%. For context, in most large European countries, household consumption accounted for about 50% of GDP. In India, it accounted for about 65%, and in the US, it accounted for about 70%. This is largely because, through a variety of mechanisms, including an undervalued currency, China essentially underpays its workers, keeping them poor and keeping China's exports competitive. Conversely, investment accounts for a disproportionately large share of Chinese GDP. World Bank data, for instance, suggests that investment made up 41% of Chinese GDP in 2023, compared to a global average of 23%. Again, to give some more context, in India, investment accounted for about 33% of GDP, and in the US, it was 21%. In and of itself, lots of investment isn't a bad thing, but too much investment can lead to a country producing essentially too much stuff. This is sort of what's happened in Chinese industry. China produces more stuff than its population can consume, which is why it runs persistent trade surpluses. But it also happened in China's property sector. Chinese property developers essentially built too many houses, hence those infamous videos of China's ghost cities, and then had to take out unsustainable amounts of debt to keep themselves afloat.
If money is fake, which it is, and Chinese investment is still very much centrally controlled and is not actually being done at the behest of capital, but instead so that there is like an internal market so that you can incentivize people into new sectors that you want to develop, then the analysis can't be interpreted with a Western capitalist lens. This is yet another problem, because like when there's any sort of like economic disaster imminent due to like overdevelopment of housing, for example, because that was one area where they were heavy-handed, right? They can just rein it back in because of the centralized control that they have. Because of the centralized control that they have, when they rein it back in, it doesn't have the same instability of like market forces that you would see in a place like the United States of America. And they are doing that, for the record. They have scaled back tremendously on this front. Doors open. Doors open. Informative chart from Ben Norton. Open presents. Thank you for the 100 big bones. Goddamn. Informative chart showing how China's economy has shifted in the past 5 years. China decided to pop its real estate bubble in 2020 with the 3 red lines policy. After that, investment in real estate fell markedly while rising fast in high-end manufacturing, especially of cars like electric vehicles and renewable energy technology such as solar panels and batteries, of which China is now the undisputed global leader. This illustrates how China's economic model has transitioned from building up lots of housing and basic infrastructure to a pronounced emphasis on developing the new quality productive forces in the science and tech sectors. One of the main reasons China can do this so effectively is because of its financial system is socialized. So state-owned banks were ordered to stop lending to real estate developers and instead give cheap loans to high-end manufacturers. So basically what they're doing, at least by my estimation, and I'm no expert here, but basically what they end up doing is like they use capitalism or like capitalist market forces like a sleeve. Instead of saying, this is what the state is doing and you're going to do it, shut the fuck up, they still have complete control over the lendership structure because all the banks are state-owned, okay? And they use that to create a positive incentive structure for people to lean into certain sectors. And people take their notes from this, but ultimately, while the winners win big, the losers don't actually end up losing so tremendously as they would in a Western country, because ultimately the state is still working at the behest of the citizens, or at least like at the behest of whatever long-term goals that they have. This, of course, is considered cheating by Western nations under the global trade design that they've put forward. This is not even a joke. They will say China are major cheaters because of their heavy subsidies, completely controlled by the state, and it makes it impossible for other countries in the Western world to compete with them. This is not a joke. If you ask any Western politician or a politician in the Western periphery, they will say, can't listen to a non-expert? Okay, well, calm down. Get an expert on. Can't listen to a non-expert. I'm over here talking about how the experts in the West are getting this wrong, and you're over here yelling at me. I'm a Twitch streamer, okay? What you see is what you're going to get. Calm down. Now, the irony here, of course, is that the best possible way to compete with China from Western countries is to become more like China. But they won't do that because their entire system is designed to not be like the Chinese system, where the government controls the flows of capital rather than capital controlling whatever the government does. Okay? That's the major problem, because their entire society is designed around sicking the free markets on their own populations. There's no way where they could turn into a command economy, a centrally planned economy, in an effort to even compete with Chinese manufacturing around the globe. I'm an expert, and I say this is bad. They should have collapsed their entire economy over a failing real estate industry. Yeah. U.S. economist Michael Pettis, who has incorrectly predicted the failure of the Chinese model for over a decade, is complaining that the Chinese policymakers avoided a recession by popping the real estate bubble and redirecting investment into manufacturing. Bad thing, but a good thing. It also means that not only Chinese consumers, but the entire world have access to very low-cost green technologies like solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles, which is obviously another good thing in order to combat climate change. Sure, Chinese companies are paying part of the cost as their profit margins have fallen significantly, but if we're serious about reducing carbon emissions, this is a positive externality. Here is an expert. But why China's GDP growth didn't slow at all? Why? Because Beijing didn't allow the decline in property investment to translate into lower overall investment. It solved the decline in property investment by engineering a surge, almost RMB for RMB, in manufacturing investment. More manufacturing, in other words, was not driven by any perceived increase in Chinese or global demand. It was wholly a reaction to a decline in property investments combined with a political determination to continue meeting excessively high GDP growth targets. The consequence was perhaps predictable. The creation of excess capacity in the property sector now shifted to the creation of excess capacity in the manufacturing sector, and especially in politically preferred sectors like solar panels, EVs, and batteries. This also is part of the reason why America is actively trying to undermine any sort of EV surge or renewable energy surge, because for two reasons. One, because this obviously still very much benefits the profit margins of the oil and gas industry, which America is leaning heavily into. They're like, fuck it, we're not doing renewable energies at all. And it's because they don't want to even give a crumb of global market share to China. But ironically enough, China is still pumping EVs and batteries and and all of these other like renewable energy sector technologies to every other country in the every other country surrounding the United States of America. And what's really interesting about this is that it's causing America to be left behind. We are actively we are actively refusing to move into this new growth sector, which for many decades was a major area that required investment, as many renewable energy loyalists would tell you. We just chose to avoid that side, and now we're in a situation where we're being left behind. Like, even if you weren't going to allow Chinese goods to flow into the country on this side because you're worried that it benefits the Chinese economy, you could have at least like invested in R&D. You could have tried to poach scientists. You could have tried to focus on building a robust renewable energy infrastructure, a manufacturing and manufacturing facilities all around the country for this new sector, this growth sector, as opposed to this finite good that is fossil fuels. This is an issue that far predates Donald Trump, mind you. That's why I say Donald Trump is an accelerant and not necessarily the major factor here of China's global dominance on these important renewable energy sectors. And it's a larger issue. It's a far more consequential, far larger issue than one president. Okay, no matter how impactful or divisive he may seem. This is an issue of capitalism.
As you might remember, to remedy this, in late 2020, the CCP introduced the so-called 3 red lines, which essentially limited how much debt developers could take on. This was terrible news for heavily indebted developers like Evergrande, and triggered a dramatic slowdown in China's property market. Now, usually you'd expect this sort of slowdown to lead to a decrease in overall GDP. After all, a property crisis would usually mean a reduction in investment, as developers pare back construction, and potentially a decrease in consumption, as homeowners cautiously pare back their spending in reaction to declines in property prices. However, this didn't really happen. Instead, as this very helpful graph by Brad Setzer at the Council on Foreign Relations neatly illustrates, investment was essentially redirected from property into manufacturing and infrastructure. This was largely a consequence of the CCP's practice of setting GDP targets for provincial governments. For context, unlike the rest of the world, where GDP growth is measured as an output of statistical authorities at the end of the year, in China, the central government sets GDP targets for provincial governments at the beginning of the year. In other words, GDP isn't just an output, but also an input. Under pressure to hit their GDP targets, local governments essentially just redirected their investment spending from property into other industries, especially politically favourable ones identified as new productive forces by the CCP.
Yeah, but this right here is basically, this is what I tried to describe as like using capitalism as a sleeve, right? Using the incentive structure, using the positive incentivization structure that exists within like controlling flows of capital in a centralized economy. China is able to redirect its entire economy to go towards new growth sectors that they think are important to invest into under different circumstances, like in the way that we imagine like the gray Soviet era USSR level of control. This would be done at the barrel of a gun. You know what I mean? This would be like, this is what we're doing. Going forward, you're building Ladas. Okay. It's Lada time. And then people are like, no, but I don't want to build a Lada. I want to, keep building homes or something. You know what I mean? And you're like, no, you're building a Lada. Shut the fuck up. And instead of doing that, they're just basically controlling the money. They're using the positive incentive that exists. People will say they're choosing winners and losers in this regard. But if everyone is on board, and if everyone understands that this is just how they move their economy, then you just have to look at overall well-being of the citizens instead as a better metric for success. Are their material conditions improving? And the answer is yes.
For a while, this strategy seemed to be working. While there was indeed a mismatch between consumption and production, Chinese producers were able to bridge the gap with exports. In other words, selling their surplus to foreign consumers. This helped boost GDP growth and allowed China to establish market dominance in high-tech industries like EVs. Even when Trump's tariffs kicked in, which obviously made it harder for Chinese producers to sell to the US, exports held up impressively well, with Chinese exporters redirecting their surplus to Europe and other markets in Southeast Asia and Latin America. You can see this if you break down China's most recent export data by region. While exports to the US have indeed fallen compared to 2024, exports to the rest of the world have held steady or increased. However, this strategy always felt somewhat unsustainable. Other countries were neither economically able nor politically willing to absorb China's surplus forever. And even though exports were holding up relatively well, China was still clearly producing too much, as evidenced by the brutal price wars we saw in industries like solar panels and EVs recently. Price wars aren't necessarily bad, but in China they contributed to the pre-existing deflation crisis and encouraged affected companies, and the local government supporting them, to take out unsustainable amounts of debt in an attempt to survive the price wars. This is a big reason why China's total debt now stands at over 300% of GDP, up from about 200% only a decade ago. Anyway, it now looks like this strategy is indeed running out of road. Prices can't go much lower, and affected companies can't take out much more debt, which is why, according to the latest data release from China's National Bureau of Statistics, in July, growth in both manufacturing and infrastructure investment declined dramatically. More generally, both industrial production and corporate investment fell markedly, with fixed asset investment falling from about 4% growth year-on-year earlier this year to 1.6% in July, and industrial production falling from 6.8% in June to 5.7% in July. This is in part because domestic demand has weakened further, with year-on-year growth in retail sales falling to a 6-month low of 3.7%, presumably at least in part because consumers are responding to deflation by paring back their spending. Weak domestic demand will obviously...
By the way, this is part of the reason why the One Belt, One Road initiative was so important for China. It's not even like opening up new flows of trade, but the Chinese investment into African nations not only helps them in the long run to develop long-standing allegiances with countries that will be more and more impactful in the global design at the United Nations and the like, but also when you develop African countries, you create secondary markets that you can sell to. You create secondary markets that you can sell the products that you're manufacturing to offset whatever kind of like tariff war that America might try to play with you. Now, of course, obviously, the entirety of the African markets is at this stage nowhere near as important as the American markets are. If China is the manufacturing engine of the entire planet, America is the consumption engine of the entire planet. It's the richest nation. It's the one that buys all the treats, right? That is the design. But that is the other reason into developing African countries. Developing African countries specifically so that there is a market that they can sell products to. Again, trade maxing.
Make things even harder for China's embattled producers because, well, weak demand makes it harder to sell stuff. Weak demand also seems to have restarted China's property crisis, with home prices in urban areas, which seem to have stabilized somewhat in late 2024, resuming their declines in the past couple of months. All in all, this is yet more evidence that China needs to boost consumption as a share of GDP. Excessive investment, whether it's in property or manufacturing, seems to be ultimately unsustainable if it's not matched by domestic demand. More consumption...
No, literally, they look to what's going on in China as like a major a problem because like they can't, like from a Western perspective, they can't boost domestic consumption. And that one of the things they always say is like that the Chinese people save too much.
Would both rebalance the economy and perhaps even ease trade-related tensions with the rest of the world. After all, more domestic demand would mean both fewer exports, and thus less risk of the politically toxic overcapacity we're seeing at the moment, but also more imports from foreign producers, which would encourage other countries to see trade with China in less zero-sum terms. Now, other China-related news has been covered across the media landscape, including hosting of Kim Jong-un for China's military parade next week, with 147 sources reporting on it. Taking a closer look, you can see that 20 of these sources come from the right and 40 of them come from the left. It's clear that there are some differences between each side of the political spectrum, with right-leaning outlets focusing on...
Okay, hold on. Here, this is another one. This is a better... Money and macro. China's increasingly bizarre economy. This seeks to understand...
The Chinese economy seemed unstoppable. Now people are spending less. The all-important housing sector is in a downturn.
A China, then, that is booming, according to its latest economic figures.
Okay, it's official. China's economy is getting weirder and weirder. On the one hand, it is showing all the signs of a Japan-style slowdown. It is plagued by deflation, youth unemployment remains stubbornly high, and the government is introducing more and more stimulus measures.
This part is true. I would say that this is perhaps the biggest problem with... If the only metric that a government is supposed to care about is the well-being of its citizens and the welfare of its citizens, the only area where... I mean, there's a couple areas where China is falling short. Obviously, I think developing the healthcare infrastructure is another area where they're falling short. But youth unemployment is definitely, as far as I've seen, youth unemployment is definitely a major issue.
To try to get people to spend more. And yet, at the same time, China's economy seems to be experiencing a second economic miracle of some sort. Last year, it was again the second fastest growing major economy in the world, and in just a few years' time, it has come to dominate advanced industries such as petroleum cars, electric vehicles, clean tech, and even AI. So, what's really going on with China's economy? Is it failing? Is it booming? Or is it somewhere in between? In a normal economy, these two stories cannot be true at the same time. After all, if consumers are not spending, then firms have no revenue, and thus they cannot be investing and producing on such a large scale. But if there's one thing that my years of studying economies around the world has shown me, China is no normal economy. So, if we cannot use normal economics to understand what's going on with China, then what the heck is going on with China's economy? To find out, I started with the most obvious potential explanation. China is lying about their GDP numbers. Yes, it may sound strange that this is the most obvious explanation, but as I covered 2 years ago, there are serious signs that Chinese provinces overstate their GDP growth every year to hit their growth targets. However, today, according to recent research by US Federal Reserve researchers, China appears to be honest about their GDP numbers. These researchers use all sorts of alternative metrics, such as retail sales and industrial production indices, and conclude that no, there are no red flags right now when it comes to China's impressive GDP growth numbers. So, that left me no choice. To find out what's actually going on in China, I had to dive into both the crises and boom stories in much more detail. My starting point was the crisis story that I talked about a lot on this channel previously. This story is about China's Japanification. Now, the core of the Japanification story was essentially that China's economy would surely follow the path of Japan, which stagnated after a gigantic property bubble burst in the early 1990s. That is, just like Japan did in the 1960s and 70s, China went through extraordinary economic growth in the 1990s and early 2000s because it used banks to invest in the country on a colossal scale. This allowed Japan and later China to rapidly catch up to the West by building infrastructure, houses, factories, and a world-class education system. To obtain foreign know-how and currency, both Japan and China used various measures to keep both wages and their currencies low. This allowed both countries to quickly become manufacturing powerhouses. And this is often considered a crucial first step in a country's economic development because manufacturing is special. It allows a country to sustainably earn enough foreign currency to pay for crucial imports that keep the economy running, crucial imports like, for example, oil. However, according to economists like Peking University professor Michael Pettis, such investment-heavy economic miracles can only get a country so far. After all, at some point, there are enough bridges, roads, houses, and factories. At this point, almost all economists, including I have to say, those at the Chinese Communist Party recognize that a developing economy needs to switch to a consumption-based model where wage and currency suppression are abandoned to allow people to have more disposable income. This could lead to a more balanced economy where all sorts of businesses emerge in response to the needs of the people. These types of businesses are often service sector businesses, such as, for example, theme parks and cafes. Developing a thriving service sector is really important for any modern economy because the service sector can employ way more people than advanced manufacturing does. So essentially, the idea is that any economy starts out agrarian, then rapidly industrializes, and then finishes its development by developing a thriving service sector, which employs most people. For example, in the UK, a whopping 95% of workers work in the service sector, even though it only accounts for about 78% of its economy. Now, to achieve these transformations rapidly, a government tends to give certain privileges, like tax exemptions or subsidies, to the sector that it wants to develop next. However, this also means that for the next stage of the economic transition, privileges need to be taken away from the previously dominant sector. This is why transformations between development stages are easier said than done. Often the owners of the preferred last sector have a lot of political capital now, meaning that they resist the transition. For example, Argentinian farmer oligarchs have long resisted the transition to industrialize. Similarly, now China's powerful industrialists, whom many of are high-ranking members of the Chinese Communist Party, are resisting the transition to a consumption-based economy because it would reduce their relative power. But what if there is a simpler option? One that can just make everyone richer. One that will allow people to spend more and to keep the economy growing without taking wealth away from government and manufacturing elites that have profited from the previous investment-led growth model. Believe it or not, but in macroeconomics, that option actually exists. And it is called blowing a housing bubble. Here's how you can get one started. The first step is to get rid of conservative regulations that prevent the housing market from taking off. Second, you make it easier and easier for banks to supply mortgages to households. And then it's easy. Just sit back and relax as the following positive feedback loop everybody in your nation feel rich. As more and more households borrow from the banks to speculate on the housing market, house prices will inevitably be pushed up. This will make homeowners feel richer, encouraging them to borrow and speculate even more. Of course, banks will be happy to help them out, as they have lent against the collateral of these houses. So if one borrower was not trustworthy, the bank can just take the house. After all, it only keeps going up in value. Crucially for the economy, rising home prices made both the Japanese and Chinese consumers feel richer, allowing them to spend more freely, just as they might have in their countries if they had chosen to switch to a consumption-based development model. Therefore, the housing bubble years helped sustain high economic growth well after most productive investment.
In America, this happens because people use real estate as a speculative asset. In China, it happened because they wanted to build more houses so that they could have rapid urbanization. And instead of telling everybody at gunpoint to build more houses now, the mechanism that they chose to do this in which was the incentives that you gave when you control all the money flows, the incentives you gave to the banks. The state controls the banks, so this is the way that they increase their housing supply. Dude, you're partially right, but the Chinese consumers were also speculating on housing. No, I understand that. I know. Which is why when it got to a point where there was too much of that happening, they bursted their own bubble.
Investments were already done, both in Japan in the 1980s and in China in the 2010s. Sadly, while these mortgages helped push GDP up, they made debt go up way faster, causing debt to GDP to rise rapidly, almost doubling from about 130% of GDP in 2008 in China to roughly 260% in 2019. This was a huge sign that this all was not sustainable. Then, when house prices inevitably started dropping, the virtuous cycle that we saw before became a doom loop. Banks started demanding their money back. Consumers could not fully repay their loans, and therefore they stopped spending their money in the economy. In Japan, reduced spending meant that its industries then started getting fewer and fewer orders. On top of that, reduced home values and more bad borrowers meant...
I don't know the exact inner workings of the Chinese healthcare structure, but from what I've read about it, I think it makes me feel like the only reason why they haven't been able to improve the healthcare infrastructure is because they need to eradicate this incentivization structure in its entirety from healthcare and have it just be a government owned and operated thing. And when there is when when you are trying to positively influence and positively incentivize people into leaning into that sector by way of opening up like new additional investment, you fail to actually build the necessary robust healthcare infrastructure. They can't just like move it, I think, given that there is too much inelastic demand when it comes to healthcare. You're watching a guy who made a video titled "Why Trump's Tariff Chaos Makes Sense, Big Picture." I'm not agreeing with this person. I'm just looking at his assessment.
And that the banks stopped lending to anyone, including industry. Therefore, industrial firms stopped investing and lost their edge. To keep the doors open, they also had to make it harder for them to repay their debts as well. Therefore, the Bank of Japan eventually stepped in to support banks, consumers, and firms with low interest rates in the hope to get Japanese consumers to start spending again and banks to start lending again. This is the story that many economists, including me, said we'd likely see in China as well.
This is the point. This is the turning point in the video where he says, we were wrong. Here's why. And he presents it as, it's bizarre. Okay?
But now, just a couple of years later, I can say that it was only half the case. Yes, we've seen the property slump stick around for many years. Yes, Chinese consumers don't spend as much anymore, causing deflation and youth unemployment. And yes, just like in Japan, we are seeing the central bank stepping in with stimulus in a big way. However, we are not seeing this translate into a recession in Chinese manufacturing. Despite Chinese consumers suffering, we are seeing Chinese factories produce more and more and more and more, even expanding into risky new sectors such as green technologies and electric vehicles. In all of my years of studying economies around the world, I can truly...
I'm telling you, this is exactly like the same failed analysis around ghost cities. Like, they're like, wow, it's so crazy. I guess they're only moving into the renewable energy sector, not because they recognize that as like the next step in our global evolution away from the finite and also world-destroying fossil fuel industry, but instead there must be a different reason. There must be a cynical reason. Oh, it's because China wants to build out. China wants to make cheap, affordable batteries because they just want to sell cheap, affordable batteries. Like, there can't be an alternative reason here beyond like fixing the economy, fixing the outputs. And that's it. That's, again, the issue with this analysis. The issue with this analysis is that like they never want to hand it to the government. They never want to hand it to having like a long-term plan in mind. It just can't be the reason. It must be for short-term profits.
Say that I've never ever seen anything like this before. This is why I think it's fair to call this China's second economic miracle. So, how did China do it? I think this graph from National University of Singapore, Professor Bert Hoffman, shows it best. As you can see here, as Chinese banks stepped back from the real estate market when...
Like, it's staring them right in the fucking face. Oh, you think they're doing this for moral reasons then? No, China is pragmatic. What do you mean moral reasons? There is no moral reason to want to continue mankind, okay? It's not moral, it's just pragmatic. They're not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. They're doing it because they recognize that this is an important sector to invest into, because unlike our politicians who supposedly read the literature showing the inevitable doom, the inevitable demise because of our over-reliance on fucking carbon polluting fossil fuel sector, they realize if we want to continue fucking living, if we want to continue surviving on this planet, then yeah, we probably have to change this dynamic. We probably have to invest heavily into R&D. We probably have to invest heavily into renewables. It doesn't have to be like a bleeding heart liberal that's pushing for this. Do you see what I mean?
Popped, they started absolutely pumping massive amounts of money into industry. This is a key difference with Japan. In Japan, private banks did not do this because it was far too risky. Similarly, in Western economies, banks absolutely did not go on a lending spree to industry after the housing crash of